So this is a continuation of the garter AKM build that I'm doing, and well, I was able to find a suitable replacement for the upper half of the handguard, and I decided to just strip off all the paint of the lower handguard and the buttstock, just to make sure that we're all starting from technically scratch. And I'm not gonna do a tutorial of that anymore. I just want everyone to be very very careful, especially when you're dealing with paint strippers. um, they're not they're not that harmful by themselves, but once they're applied on to the paint, as you can see, starts to have that chemical reaction, and it will definitely burn your skin once it does that. So just be very careful. Always use a natural brush. That's what I use. And we'll try to check we'll try to check and see like what else we need to do regarding this. Typical paint removal is more on scraping. It's a lot of waiting. This is gonna take at least around 5 to 10 minutes to really soften up the thick paint that I initially laid down. And what we're aiming for is hopefully a Russian red rendition. Okay, so after a couple of um, hours of using the paint stripper and scraping off all the old paint, uh, I was able to uh, bring it back to bare wood. And there's still a lot of spots that needs to be cleaned up, such as this, which initially, when it was painted over before, this is probably embedded in, so it took a lot more stain than normal. But we'll be able to sand that down and remove that. See, and hopefully, if you're doing your own wood project, don't be don't be too concerned about miscoloration of the wood when it comes to the pieces. Okay, because some woods are lighter than normal because they never took stain, such as this came from probably a Chinese airsoft rifle, wherein it was just lacquered on. But we'll be able to even that out, probably with a good nice red mahogany stain. So the goal is, of course, to remove all the old paint. Okay, the old paint, the old stain, all the top coat part should be taken off. And what I do is I use, after using the paint stripper and scraping off as much as I could, I go over it with 150 120 grit sandpaper, just to see, okay, just to expose the real wood underneath, and to see how clean I've gotten in the process. And after that, I use a wet rag. So the reason why you have to use the wet rag is, first, to remove all the dust that's in the pores of the wood. Okay, and don't use a rag that's too wet. Of course, it should just be damp. And what happens is, it's going to help later on with the wood. It works some sort as a sort of a wood conditioner, wherein when it dries up, it's going to open up the pores of the wood, making the stain more acceptable to the wood. So what we're probably gonna see next is after a day or two, I'm gonna let this dry for a day or two, and then I'm gonna come back and start putting on the stain. So this is day 4 of my AKM woodworking project. So I was able to sand down all the uneven spots, and the remaining varnish that was initially used. And as you can see, I already stained it. The stain I used was a red walnut stain, which is readily available in almost any hardware. I'm not very particular with the brand as long as it's oil based, because technically what we're trying to do is we're trying to saturate the wood. Now this is this is the first painting of the top coat, and as you can see, it's not that glossy. I'm trying to put it on very very thin, and then try to build it up from there. I'm not sure if I should stop at this point, because I'm really liking this finish. It's a bit rough as compared to all my other jobs, but we'll see from here. I'll probably let this dry for 2 to 3 hours, and then I'll sand it down with a very fine piece of sandpaper just to see where I'm at, as you can see there. And by the way, the polyurethane varnish that I'm using is a polyurethane 2-part varnish. Never try to use those 1-part those single stage polyurethanes, because in my experience they always never harden as much as I would want to. So what I use is an automotive level of polyurethane top coat. Typical brands are of course Anzal, K92, probably some other DuPont. And it's not necessary that you use a compressor, although it would be very very useful, since compressors can lay it down a lot more even than a paintbrush. But I've grown accustomed to it. So the next video would be the next probably later I'll be able to show a video after it's been wet sanded, and then putting on another coat. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build up as many coats as we could, so that all those small spots, small holes will be filled in. Okay. So this is day 5 of the painting project, and last night I put on a fresh new layer of paint on the wood parts. Now as you can see, there's still a lot of dimples, and also there's some bubbles that formed, but I'm not too worried about that. It will come out after I block sanded it. I use a wet sanding block with 600 grit sandpaper, and hopefully the next time we'll be laying down some finish coat on it, and so that would be the last coat. So this is a total of probably 5 coats that I did. Partly you have to do that because of course we want to, as much as possible, fill in all the dimples, along with what we're aiming for is somewhat of a showroom shine. Definitely, yeah, it still needs some work, but of course, if you're happy with this, okay, at this point you can actually stop. But since this is going to be somewhat of a show gun, I'll have to sand it down and refinish it. Okay, this is probably the least fun part of painting and refinishing gun stocks. Well, a lot of people don't really go this far with regards to refinishing gun parts, but of course, well, it's my gun, so I'm trying to get. I decided, and finally, I'm trying to get as much as possible a piano finish on the gun parts. So one reason why a lot of people don't go this far is because, of course, the smoother the finish and the glossier the finish, the more the imperfections would show up. So wet sanding is easy, but it's tedious, and you have to be very careful, especially when it comes to the edges such as this, because it's very easy to sand through the edges. A lot of people use a foam backing when they use sandpaper, okay, but I've been doing this for some time now, and I somehow trust my abilities when it comes to wet sanding. So what you need to do is, of course, don't go beyond 600. Okay, there are a lot of sandpapers that are finer than 600, but I choose to do this. So with just 600 grit, it's not smooth enough. Okay, to leave a very fine base for the next finish that's gonna come on, or for the next layer of paint that's gonna come on. And it's also not rough enough to really remove a lot of material. So one thing you have to do is, of course, get a container and dip the sandpaper for probably at least 2 to 3 minutes, just to make sure that it's soft and pliable. And one tip that I can give is, of course, always sand with the grain. Okay, so direction is horizontal, so you just keep on sanding. Okay, very light. Don't apply too much pressure on it, because you might burn the finish, or you might sand through the finish. And what you're going to end up is something like this. So you can see there are dark shiny spots, and along with somewhat a white layer on it. And this is what the aim is, of course, to sand as much as possible off. Okay, so that all those dimples would be gone. Okay, but don't be too concerned too much about it, because, as I said, we're going to keep on adding on paint. Okay, and eventually it will fill up. Remember that painting and finishing wood pieces is actually a very time consuming process. So you need to wait for it to dry, and then you wet sand again, and then you put on a new layer, and then wait for it to dry, and then you sand again, and then so eventually you're going to end up, if you're really pushing for a piano finish, it's going to end up, at least you're going to do this process at least what 4 or 5 times, in my experience. And that ensures that everything is sealed up and everything is as smooth as it can be. So this is day 7 of the restoration project that we have on the AKM. So since the last take, I wet sanded it 2 times and applied around 4 additional coats, and it seems to have turned out as well as I wanted it to, although there are still some very minor imperfections. But of course, we can't avoid that because you're dealing with wood, and sometimes eventually what you have to remember is after a week or two, um, the wood will still continue to draw the finish in. So probably after a week or two, it would have those lines along the pores, and but right now it came out very smooth, as you can see here. So what's the next step? Next step would be to let this dry for at least 2 days. Remember that drying is different from curing. The total cure time for this type of paint would be probably around a week. If there's still a faint odor of the polyurethane, then that means that it hasn't cured through. But after 2 days, of course, it can be wet sanded again, and it will leave you a very smooth, but cloudy finish. So what I intend to do is after 2 days I'll be wet sanding it, but with very fine sandpaper. I'll probably be using this 2500 grit. Of course, we'll be taking down the dust nibs and some other minor imperfections, and then probably use a cut and polish rubbing compound, and what else? Probably we'll use a swirl remover to bring it back to the original shine. This is still very soft, so of course, the thing with curing polyurethane and two-part paints, of course, avoid using it in a very damp environment. But in my experience, it's not really affected much by that. You just have to make sure that it's neither too hot or too cold or too damp. As long as you bring it indoors to cure, it should cure properly.